You replay conversations long after they end. You revisit decisions that are already behind you. You imagine futures that haven't happened yet. And somewhere in that quiet repetition, you start asking yourself why your mind won't stop, why it keeps circling the same questions, why clarity never arrives, and you label it overthinking. But what's actually happening is far more specific and far more human, because overthinking, in psychology, is often not a flaw in thinking at all, but a signal that the brain is stuck in what cognitive science would call an unfinished identity loop, a state where the mind senses that something about the self is unresolved, and therefore refuses to let go, much like how unfinished tasks linger in memory through the Zeigarnik effect. Except here, the task is not an email or a chore, but you, your direction, your sense of who you are becoming. And this is why the thoughts don't feel random, but personal, why they surface most when you're alone, walking at night, lying in bed, or standing under the shower. Because these are moments when the default mode network comes online, the brain system responsible for self-reflection, memory, and future simulation. And when identity is stable, this network hums quietly in the background. But when identity is in flux, it stays active, scanning, replaying, checking, asking the same questions again and again, not to torment you, but to resolve uncertainty, like a navigation system that can't calculate a route because it doesn't know the destination yet. And this often happens after subtle life shifts rather than dramatic breakdowns, when your old identity no longer fits but a new one hasn't fully formed, when you've grown internally faster than your external life reflects, when expectations you once lived by no longer feel true, and the mind responds by looping, because from a neurological perspective, uncertainty is registered as a form of threat, activating low-grade stress and keeping the brain engaged until coherence is restored. Which is why thinking harder rarely helps, because identity is not solved by analysis alone. Identity is built through action, feedback, and lived emotional experience. And when thinking happens without new input, the brain simply replays the same material, like rereading a page and hoping the words will change, which is why the solution is not to stop thinking, but to change what the brain is working with, starting by naming the state you're in. Because research on cognitive reappraisal shows that labeling an experience reduces amygdala activation and lowers internal noise, and saying, "I am in a transition," tells the brain that uncertainty is temporary rather than dangerous, then releasing the demand for premature certainty, because certainty is not a prerequisite for identity, but a byproduct of it, and forcing answers too early increases anxiety and keeps the loop active, whereas reframing the question from "who should I be" to "what is forming" shifts the brain from threat mode into curiosity, which is neurologically safer, and from there, identity begins to solidify through small behavioral experiments rather than grand decisions. Because neuroscience consistently shows that behavior precedes belief, not the other way around, meaning the brain updates its self-concept based on evidence, not intention. So small aligned actions act like data points that slowly teach the brain who you are becoming, while at the same time reducing hyper self-monitoring, the habit of constantly watching and evaluating yourself, which increases rumination and keeps the default mode network overactive, and instead engaging in activities that create absorption or flow, because flow states quiet self-referential processing and give the brain a break from identity scanning, allowing integration to happen in the background rather than through force. And when these elements come together, the loop begins to close naturally, not abruptly, not dramatically, but quietly, as the brain senses enough coherence to stop asking, much like how a bridge under construction becomes walkable before it looks finished, and overthinking fades not because you silenced it, but because it no longer needs to speak, because the identity signal has stabilized. And until then, it helps to remember that looping thoughts are not proof that you are lost, but evidence that something important is changing, that you are between versions of yourself, and that the mind is doing exactly what it evolved to do when the self is unfinished, which is to keep the question alive until the answer becomes lived rather than thought.